Welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going on a little journey through time
Yeah.
and looking at some really interesting parallels between 17th century Britain and the world we live in today.
Hey,
And to guide us on this trip, we're using as our source material a discussion between two historians from the podcast, The Rest is History.
excellent.
And you might be surprised to learn just how much the past is reflected in our current times.
It's often said that history doesn't repeat,
Right.
but it rhymes.
Yeah.
And as we dig into these parallels,
Oh.
it does feel like we're seeing some familiar patterns emerging.
It's a bit like deja vu in a way.
Yeah.
One of the most striking things I noticed right off the bat was the experience of plague in 17th century London
Right.
and how that compares to our experience with COVID-19. I mean, they had
Yeah.
lockdowns, they had fear of infection spreading through everyday objects.
Right.
It's eerily similar.
The parallels are certainly there. I mean, the 1665 London plague was absolutely devastating.
Yeah.
It killed about 100,000 people, a quarter of the city's population.
Wow.
And to escape the outbreak, the court actually fled London for Oxford.
Oh, wow.
Imagine the disruption that must have caused.
I know it's like a 17th century version of working from home,
Yeah.
but with, much higher stakes.
Absolutely.
One thing I thought was really fascinating was how people back then reacted to the plague.
Yeah.
There's this diary entry from Samuel Pepys,
Right.
the diarist, and he's worried about getting a new wig
Yeah.
because he thinks it might be carrying the plague.
Yeah.
It reminds me of how I used to wipe down like every single grocery item
Right.
in the early days of the pandemic.
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of crazy.
Well, it reminds us that,
Yeah.
fear and uncertainty are just universal human experiences,
Right.
regardless of the time period.
It's true.
And it's interesting to think about how both the 17th century
Okay.
and today have witnessed these significant climate shifts.
Hmm.
So back then, they were dealing with the Little Ice Age.
Oh.
And today, of course, we're grappling with global warming.
That's an interesting connection. I hadn't really thought about that.
Yeah.
Is there a link, do you think, between climate change and these outbreaks of disease?
Well, the historian Jeffrey Parker
Okay.
argues in his book, Global Crisis, that climate change
Okay.
very often leads to widespread upheaval, including pandemics.
Wow.
It's obviously a complex interplay of different factors,
Right.
but the historical parallels are really hard to ignore.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, if climate change played a role in past crises, then understanding those patterns could help us anticipate and maybe even prevent future challenges.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought.
Yeah.
It definitely gives a new perspective on what we're facing today.
Definitely.
So speaking of challenges,
Right.
the 17th century was also a time of intense political and social division,
Right.
culminating, of course, in the English Civil War. And it's hard to even imagine this, but proportionally, the death toll from those civil wars was actually higher
Wow.
than in both world wars.
The English Civil Wars were incredibly divisive and incredibly destructive.
Yeah.
And just like today, we're seeing that the emergence of new media played a big role in fueling those divisions.
Okay.
Back then, it was the printing press, pamphlets, and newspapers,
Right.
which allowed information and misinformation to spread much faster.
It's like the social media of their time.
Exactly.
It really is.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, was there a silent majority back then, too, who just got drowned out by the loudest voices?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
And just as today, there were groups in the 17th century who were fighting for greater representation and a voice.
Right.
You had the Levelers, for example.
Okay.
They were this radical political movement who advocated for wider suffrage
Right.
and challenged the existing power structures.
It's like the activists of today who are fighting for voting rights or social justice. So it seems like the struggle for representation
Yes.
is this recurring theme
It is.
throughout history.
Yeah,
That's fascinating.
definitely.
Speaking of shifting perceptions, the conversation about the 17th century also touched on Oliver Cromwell.
Right.
And, there are a lot of misconceptions about him.
Yeah.
For example, many people believe that Cromwell banned Christmas.
Right. Well, the truth is a bit more complicated than that.
Yeah.
While the Puritans didn't completely ban Christmas,
Okay.
they did push for a more somber, religiously focused observance.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I have to admit, it's kind of ironic that Boris Johnson, who's known for, indulging,
Yeah.
ended up enacting restrictions during COVID that were almost Puritan in their strictness.
Yeah.
It really shows you how perceptions of historical figures can change over time.
Yeah, Cromwell himself is often portrayed as this dour, austere figure.
Right.
But there's actually evidence to suggest that he enjoyed music and celebrations.
Hmm.
This highlights how historical narratives are constantly being reinterpreted.
Right.
It's not just about the dates and the facts.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the complexities of human motivation
Right.
and how the past shapes our present.
It's like history is this giant puzzle, and we're constantly finding new pieces and trying to make them fit.
Yeah.
So this brings us to another really interesting parallel.
Okay.
The historians talked about this connection
Right.
between 17th century political allegiances
Uh-huh.
and modern-day Brexit voting patterns.
That's right. They found that areas that supported the Royalists during the Civil War
Yeah.
tend to align with the areas that voted for Brexit,
Mm.
and areas that sided with Parliament lean towards Remain.
It's almost like those old divisions are still echoing centuries later
Yeah.
and influencing how people view the world and their place in it.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
The historians discuss the prevalence of witch hunts in the 17th century and drew this parallel to something very relevant today:
Yeah.
online attacks and cancel culture.
That's right. Both witch hunts and online shaming tend to target individuals who hold unpopular views or challenge prevailing social norms.
Right.
And in both cases, the consequences can be absolutely devastating for the people involved.
Yeah, that's a chilling thought, isn't it?
It is.
How easy it is for people to be targeted and vilified,
Yes.
especially when they dare to express views that go against the grain.
Exactly. It's this disturbing trend that seems to transcend time.
Yeah.
And it often feels like those with the loudest voices
Okay.
and the biggest platforms
Yeah.
are the ones who become targets.
Right.
The historians even mentioned J.K. Rowling,
Yeah.
who has faced intense criticism for her views.
And it's not even just about disagreeing with someone's opinion, right? It's about silencing them completely.
Exactly. In both the 17th century
Yeah.
and today,
Yeah.
there's this sense of mob mentality and a rush to judgment.
Often without a fair hearing or due process.
Right.
What I find really striking is that witch hunts were one of the few things that actually united Catholics and Protestants in the 17th century.
Oh, wow.
They both participated in persecuting those who were perceived as different or dangerous.
It makes you wonder if the urge to find a common enemy,
Yeah.
even if it means setting aside your own differences,
Right.
is just part of human nature.
Well, it's a thought, isn't it?
It is a bit disheartening,
Yeah.
but I guess it also speaks to the power of fear
Right.
and how easily it can be manipulated.
And we're seeing a similar dynamic today, where
Right.
extremes on the political spectrum sometimes find common ground in attacking those they see as opponents. It's a reminder that division and polarization can be incredibly powerful forces,
Right.
regardless of the century.
Okay, well, before we get too doom and gloom,
Right.
let's switch gears a bit and talk about the relationship between England and Scotland.
The historians pointed out that the 17th century offers some interesting insights
Yeah.
into the current push for Scottish independence.
Absolutely. The 17th century was a very turbulent time
Right.
for the relationship between England and Scotland.
Yeah.
One of the key triggers for all the turmoil was Charles I's attempt
Okay.
to impose a specific model of religion on Scotland,
Yeah.
which was met with very fierce resistance.
Yeah.
It really demonstrates how religious identity and national identity can become intertwined,
Right.
and how attempts to force one group's beliefs on another can often lead to conflict.
Yeah, it's amazing how those historical events
Yeah.
can still resonate centuries later.
Absolutely. The 17th century example shows us that these tensions around national sovereignty
Sure.
and cultural identity are not new,
Right.
and the desire for self-determination can be a powerful driving force for political movements.
It's true.
And we see similar dynamics playing out in different parts of the world today.
Right. It's like history is giving us a window into the complexities of these issues.
Yeah,
Wow. It's been quite a journey so far, hasn't it?
it has.
We've covered plagues, political divisions, social unrest, cancel culture.
Right.
It seems like the 17th century was quite a wild ride.
It was a period of immense transformation and upheaval,
Yeah.
but it's important to remember that it was also a time of great intellectual ferment
Right.
and innovation.
Yeah.
It reminds us that even in times of crisis,
Yeah.
progress and new ideas can still emerge.
So what are some of the biggest takeaways for you from this deep dive so far? What surprised you the most?
Well, I think what struck me the most was realizing that history isn't this fixed narrative.
Right.
It's constantly being reinterpreted and reshaped.
Yeah.
The way different groups reinterpret figures like Cromwell, for example, to fit their own agendas,
Yeah.
shows that history is very much alive
Mm,
and open to debate.
that's true.
It's not just about memorizing dates and facts.
Right.
It's about understanding the complexities of human motivation
Right?
and the interplay of forces that shape events.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And that's what makes exploring history so fascinating.
Absolutely.
It's like peeling back the layers of time to uncover the stories, the struggles, and the triumphs that have brought us to where we are today.
It's a journey.
And maybe by understanding the past, we can gain a little wisdom to help us navigate the present.
That's the hope.
It is.
Yeah, it really is a reminder that, even in those darkest moments, there's a possibility of progress and a more enlightened future.
That's actually quite encouraging to think about, that even in that time period, those seeds were being planted,
Absolutely.
So I don't know about you, but this deep dive has left me wanting to learn even more about the 17th century.
Me too. It's a fascinating period.
It is.
So much to teach us about our own world.
Yeah, and it's clear that this period has so much to teach us about our world today.
Absolutely.
So for any listeners who are feeling inspired to delve a little deeper themselves, the historians on the rest of history recommended a few really great books.
They did.
We'll be sure to include those in our show notes for everybody.
Awesome.
But there was Jeffrey Parker's Global Crisis,
Yes.
which we mentioned earlier.
Great book.
Paul Lay's Providence Lost.
Another great book.
Christopher Hill's God's Englishman. And of course, the always entertaining Samuel Pepys' Diary.
Right.
And if you're in the mood for something a little different,
Yeah.
a little historical fiction,
Yes.
Ian Pear's novel, An Instance of the Finger Post,
Oh, yeah.
is a really brilliant read set in the late 17th century.
A fantastic book.
And it brings that world to life in a way that I think is both engaging and thought-provoking.
Absolutely.
It really is.
Yeah.
It just goes to show, the more we understand the past, the better equipped we are to navigate the present.
Right.
And maybe even shape a better future.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this historical adventure.
It's been fun.
Until next time, keep those minds curious and keep diving deep.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. The past can offer us some valuable lessons if we're willing to listen. When we look at the 17th century as this mirror to our own time, it's not just about seeing the similarities. It's about learning from them.
Yeah.
If they struggled with misinformation and division and scapegoating, how can we, with the benefit of hindsight, navigate those same issues more effectively?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's like we have this roadmap, with all these cautionary tales, but also potential solutions.
Right.
What do you think, based on everything we've talked about, what are some of those solutions?
Well, despite all the turmoil and upheaval, that era eventually saw the emergence of greater tolerance and a stronger emphasis on individual conscience.
Right.
It wasn't a straight line.
Right.
But ultimately, there was this shift
Yeah.
towards more inclusive and equitable ways of thinking and governing.
Okay.
And that offers us, I think, some hope for today.
So even in the midst of all the chaos and division, there's always that possibility of progress.
There is.
And a more enlightened future.
Yeah. It's encouraging to think
Yeah.
that those seeds of change were planted
Yeah.
even in such a turbulent time.
It is encouraging.
Yeah.
So it seems that even when things look really bleak,
Yeah.
the human spirit has this remarkable ability to adapt and grow.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good note to end on, I think.
I think so, too.
Well, hey, thanks for joining us on this historical adventure.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Yeah.
Until next time, keep those minds curious.
Absolutely.
And keep diving deep.